Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us to the second session in our series, Palestine, Israel, A History of Oppression and Rebellion. Tonight, we're looking at a question that if you are a socialist, a Marxist, you will have heard a lot, especially in the Corbyn years. Namely that, well, yes, as a socialist, yeah, you're anti-Semitic. And look at that Karl Marx fella. He was anti-Semitic, and don't you follow his writings, etc. So it's not surprising that you, lefty, are an anti-Semite too. Now, I think we're looking at the question tonight, what is anti-Semitism, which we'll discuss, and was Marx anti-Semitic? I think we all know the answer already, probably not, unless he was a self-hating Jew. I mean, that seems unlikely, but of course, we will be discussing the question in more detail. And it is very important, I think, for us socialists to get it right, because this accusation will come up over and over again in this period, in particular, when any criticism of Israel is construed as anti-Semitic wrongly. I mean, there is anti-Semitism about, just like there's racism about, but being critical of the state of Israel does not mean automatically you're anti-Semitic. So tonight, to introduce the subject to us is Ian Spencer, who's looked at Marx's text on the Jewish question, and then some other texts as well. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, comrades. This essay written by Marx in 1844, was an important part of Marx's development, as we'll go on to see. But the central thing that I'm arguing here is not only was Marx not anti-Semitic, but that to understand the comments that he makes, not only does it have to be placed in the context of the time, but in the context of Marx's own profound understanding of history in general and Jewish history in particular. Isaac Deutscher described Marx, along with others such as Sigmund Freud and Leon Trotsky, and as a non-Jewish Jew. So from the point of view of him being of Jewish heritage, but not religious, but still nevertheless deeply influenced by the rabbinical tradition that was part of his family. So without further ado, Karl Heinrich Marx was the son of Herschel Marx. Herschel Marx subsequently converted to Lutheran Christianity before Karl Marx was born. And when he did so, he Germanized his name to Heinrich. The Marx family had provided most of the rabbis to Trier in the years before Marx and indeed Herschel Marx were born. With a long line of rabbis. So his grandfather was a rabbi, and he had uncles who were rabbis. So they were a non-religious family, but also it was partly in keeping with the fact that he grew up in that part of Germany, which had been invaded by France and come under a brief period of the Code Napoleon. So there was a whole period of life in Germany at that time, which had been influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution. And of course, it was also a time of a autocratic monarchy in Prussia. And many of the debates that we see in these early years of Marx were debates around the coming into being, really, of liberal democracy, of trying to realize the ideas of the French Revolution in the context of Germany still ruled over by kings and princes and electors, and coming under, of course, eventually the overall tutelage of the Prussian Kaiser. So when Heinrich Marx converted to Lutheran Christianity, it was largely to escape discrimination in Prussia. Karl Marx's mother, Henriette Pressburg, her father was also a rabbi. So Heinrich Marx was not religious anyway, and for him to convert to Lutheran Christianity to evade the discrimination that was a feature of Prussia at the time was no great difficulty, really, as far as I can see. In 1843, Bruno Bauer, who was a right Hegelian, as most of you will know, Marx studied philosophy. He was originally supposed to be studying law. That was his father's wish, so that he could make a living. But instead became taken in by philosophy and pursued philosophical studies for most, right up to his doctorate, which was on Epicurus and Democritus, and a comparison between the two Greek philosophers. So the Judenfrage of 1843 by Bruno Bauer was part of that whole debate which Marx and Engels were having with the right Hegelians at the time. The Hegelian Hegel really dominated German philosophy at the time, and kind of split. So really, Bruno Bauer remained pretty influential, but tended to influence instead people like the anarchist Max Stirner rather than someone like Karl Marx, who was one of his most trenchant critics. The Judenfrage was criticized by Marx, but there was also another essay by Bruno Bauer. I won't attempt the German. The capacity of present-day Jews and Christians to become free. And it's the critique of that second essay which Marx makes a few statements which have been interpreted by some as anti-Semitic. But just to give an outline of what Bruno Bauer was talking about, he was really hostile to most religion. I mean, bearing in mind, we're living in a time when there were state religions in many states. So Austria was predominantly Catholic and was dominated by the Catholic Church, and some of the German states were too. Others were Protestant, and there was a lot of pressure to conform to either to Lutheran Protestantism or Catholicism. And from that point of view, Bruno Bauer, who is also accused of being anti-Semitic, is also critical of Christianity. Not only did Marx and Engels criticize Bauer, but also more extensively in the Holy Family, which they published in 1845, and again in the German Ideology, which, as you know, was never published and left to the gnawing criticism of the mice. So Bauer was really trying to argue that in order to have religious emancipation, the thing to do is to give up being religious, and in particular, give up being Jewish. He was arguing in the second essay, the capacity of present-day Jews and Christians to become free, and in the sense that Jews had more of a task in hand than Christians did. So from the point of view of Judaism being an earlier version of Christianity, they had further to go, as it were, in relinquishing their religion. And was arguing really that it was about what was at stake was liberal democracy and the universalism of being a citizen. In order to be a citizen, Bauer was arguing one has to be free of religion to be fully a citizen. Marx, as we know, was critical of that, and we'll look at the reasons why. So in order to be a citizen, questions like religion shouldn't come into it. And again, we go look at the French Revolution and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which makes being religious or not a personal matter. It becomes a part of civil society rather than being a part of political society, as part of the state. So in these two essays, Bruno Bauer puts forward a case for becoming more of a citizen by relinquishing one's religion, and in particular the Jews. And the argument goes something like this: we Christians are not liberated, so how can you expect us to liberate you, as it were? By contrast, The Jewish Question on the Jewish Question by Marx, Zur Judenfrage, published in 1844 in the German-French Yearbook, which is a journal which only had one issue published, but nevertheless had quite a significant impact. Not only was Zur Judenfrage published in this edition, but also the introduction to a contribution of the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which I'll mention a little more later. But also Engels' first foray into the critique of political economy. And remember, it was Engels rather than Marx who was the first one to write a critique of political economy. And it was Engels' contribution to this critique that so impressed Marx so much that they became firm friends and lifelong collaborators on the communist project. But in a sense, all of these essays were written before either of them were really a communist. They would have identified as socialist or something, or on the left in some respects, and certainly critical of the state enough to get them into trouble. But it was really in a period when what was at stake was the development of a modern bourgeois republic, with the freedoms from feudalist interference in one's private life, of the rights of the citizen to be free from arbitrary detention, arbitrary expropriation, and so on. So this was quite a significant period in the development of the thinking of Marx and Engels. And so you have the two parts of Zur Judenfrage. The first was really an analysis of the dual nature of the citizen, and in the actual essay itself, on the living individual, the human concrete individual, and the citoyen are addressed. So for Marx, there is this dual nature in what it is to be a citizen in the context of a liberal democracy, the living individual, and also the citizen, the bearer of rights. And the owner of property, crucially, even if the only property you own is yourself, because Germany at this time was still kind of not long out of feudalism. And remember, at this time, feudalism was still firmly intact in Tsarist Russia, where the emancipation of the serfs didn't take place until the 1860s. So the second part of Zur Judenfrage is a critique of the capacity of present-day Jews and Christians to become free, which was also published by Bauer. So let's take the bull by the horns and read a big load of text. I've truncated it. This has been truncated somewhat for me, actually, but it's cut it back a bit. But I just want to read it out, because let's really get to grips with what he's actually saying. Let us consider the actual worldly Jew, not the Sabbath Jew as Bauer does, but the everyday Jew. Let us not, this is the crucial line, let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. An organization of society which would abolish the preconditions for huckstering, and therefore the possibility of huckstering, would make the Jew impossible. The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only because he has acquired financial power, but also because through him, and also apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. Money is the jealous God of Israel, in the face of which no other God may exist. Money degrades all the gods of man and turns them into commodities. The bill of exchange is the real God of the Jew. His God is only an illusory bill of exchange. The chimerical nationality of the Jew is the nationality of the merchant, of the man of money in general. So why would Marx associate money and God and Judaism and exchange in this way? What Marx is doing is actually drawing upon his knowledge of Jewish history and his understanding of the way Judaism played a particular role in society, to say that it is not enough to say, in order to give up, in order to become emancipated, you have to give up your religion. You have to, what the real emancipation comes from giving up the conditions under which one has religion at all. And remember the other thing that was being published in the German-French yearbook, which we'll come on to in a minute. This is the bit that's often interpreted as being anti-Semitic, because he's saying that it looks as if he's saying that all Jews are money grubbers or whatever else. But what he's pointing out is that monotheism, that Judaism comes into being at a particular time in history and plays a particular role in history. Just to put it into context of Marx's general understanding of religion, here's one of those other famous things that was in that particular yearbook. And it's a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Famously, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears for which religion is the halo. So here we see a reflection of what Bauer is also arguing, but Marx is, in a sense, doing it a lot better. He's pointing out that it's not Judaism that gives rise to capitalism, but capitalism that gives rise to Judaism. It's that veil of tears, the suffering of living in a class society, that gives rise to religion in general, which it provides this soul of soulless conditions. The idea of being the opium of the people is often confused with modern day narcotics addiction, but it's actually, you could buy opium over the counter in those days, and you took it just to help you get through a miserable life. So Marx is being critical of religion, not from the point of view of being hostile to religion. He's trying to place religion in the context of his materialist understanding of Hegel, the idealist philosopher. For Hegel, it's the ideas of the world, as it were, that are the important transformative thing. But here for Marx, it's the material basis of society which gives rise to its expression in a religious form. There's one or two other bits and pieces that are mildly embarrassing when you read Marx's work through modern eyes, as it were. This is Ferdinand Lassalle, who some of you will have met when we did the session on party building, on the series on party building. Ferdinand Lassalle was actually born Ferdinand Lassalle in Breslau, Silesia, now Wrocław in Poland, who was the son of Haman Lassalle, a Jewish silk merchant. He himself was a lawyer, and they became friends in 1848 because they were both militants in the revolutions of 1848. There's a reference in a letter to Engels from Marx on the 30th of July, 1862, in which he refers to Ferdinand Lassalle as a Jewish nigger. And again, you don't have to look too far for learned essays on that Marx was not only an anti-Semite, but he was also a racist. Let's put a few things into context. Ferdinand Lassalle was a flamboyant and interesting character. In the letter in question, he'd been to stay with Marx in 1861, and most of the letter is actually made up of Marx complaining about being skint, and and that Lassalle would rather go and spend his money on speculative ventures rather than help Marx out, which was one thing. Lassalle himself was a strangely contradictory character as a person who was helped to found the first German socialist party, the Social Democratic Workers' Party. He was a lawyer and pursued the interests of Countess Sophie von Hatzfeldt for about 8 years in different courts throughout Europe. And she was extremely grateful to him and gave him a pension for life, effectively, because she then won her case and came into a huge amount of money. She effectively was able to inherit her estate. And without Ferdinand Lassalle's help, she wouldn't have been able to do that. I say Ferdinand Lassalle was, as a socialist, a very contradictory figure, a person who was in contact with Otto von Bismarck, and who he got on with Bismarck. Lassalle regarded himself as a patriotic German, and he wasn't even opposed to the Kaiser either. He just wanted there to be, as it were, a kind of constitutional monarchy, rather like Britain. So the friendship with Marx was rather strained. Engels was rather less fond of Lassalle and was often much more guarded about him and very suspicious of his contacts with Bismarck. If you read his letter and the references to him being a Jewish nigger, you have to understand that at the time, the term Jewish nigger was nigger at all wasn't a racial slur. Marx and Engels regularly wrote to one another on an almost daily basis, and because they were both polyglot, they both regularly wrote. Well, most of their letters were in German, but they regularly put in other little bits of different language. So Marx routinely, when he wrote to Engels, addressed him as "Dear Fred" in English at the top line. Was "Dear Fred," and then off he goes in German. And at various other points, they'll put in bits of French or Italian or whatever else. Marx's little kind of nickname, as it were, that he was known in an affectionate way to, that Engels would often write back, was "Dear Moore." Moore, because of Marx's own swarthy complexion. And so the use of the term nigger was quite widespread and wasn't necessarily regarded as pejorative. Of course, it was much more pejorative in the United States and became more pejorative in the rest of the English-speaking world later on. But even up until 1955, if anybody remembers the classic war film The Dam Busters, Wing Commander Guy Gibson's black Labrador is called nigger. Quite unselfconsciously, and when the film was made in 1955, no one thought anything of it. And this is 1955. Now, if you ever see the film again, it's usually overdubbed, and the dog is called Digger. But that wasn't the case when it was produced. So the term wasn't regarded as pejorative, and it was often used in English in the letters between Marx and Engels. At one point, at various points, I think, Marx also talks about his daughter, Laura, having married a nigger, who was in fact because he was his grandfather, Paul Lafargue. Laura was married to Paul Lafargue, and Paul Lafargue's grandmother was of African origin. So the term wasn't being used in a way which was regarded as a racial slur at the time. And as I say, Marx himself was often referred to by Engels as Moore. Now I want to put all of that into proper context, and I'm going to do it by this superb book called The Jewish Question, a Marxist interpretation by Abraham Leon. Abraham Leon was born as Abraham Weinstock in Warsaw He was a Belgian Trotskyist who was subsequently tortured and murdered in Auschwitz. And it's a history of the Jewish people. What Abraham Leon is arguing is that the Jews in the ancient world and subsequently in the early medieval world constituted a people class. In the ancient world, initially the spread of Judaism was in the Hellenized part of the ancient world. So after the conquest of much of the known world by Alexander the Great, cities were established and trade was a feature around the Mediterranean in particular, but throughout the Hellenized world. The people class is a reference to the fact that the Jews constituted a trading nation, as it were, rather like the Phoenicians. They were a nation, they were a people class that occupied a particular position within society. In the ancient world, they were crucial in, for example, the trade between East and West, which would, of course, go through the Levant. So at one point, the Jewish population of Alexandria was considerably bigger than Jerusalem. Even before the destruction of the destruction of the temple, the second temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE AD, the Common Era. Even before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, there were more Jews living outside the Levant than in. The diaspora was already a feature long before the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Another thing, which of course is, we tend to think of it as something innovative by Shlomo Sand and the invention of the Jewish people, but actually Abraham Leon got there a lot earlier. In the Jewish question, he talks about the way in which the Romans didn't expel the entire population of the Levant, of Canaan, Judea, Samaria. They didn't expel all the people of the land. They might well have rounded up what they would have thought of as the ringleaders of Jewish rebellions and carted them off in chains to Rome to be slaves or eaten by wild animals in the Colosseum. But they didn't remove people from the land. Far from it. Who else was going to feed the Roman legionaries? Who else was going to provide the social surplus to be extracted from Judea, Samaria, Canaan? Very far from being displaced from the land, the same people remained there, and arguably the people currently living in Palestine are the direct descendants of those very people. But of course, over time, they had converted to Islam. So effectively, trade became what the Jewish people did in the ancient world. They constituted a very important part of the ancient world. Remember, whilst Christianity was a religion of the poor and dispossessed, and was illegal, Judaism wasn't. And Judaism played an important part in Roman society throughout what had been the Hellenized world, as providing a very important trading caste in the context of the ancient world. And later on, in the early part of the medieval period, also constituted a caste within medieval society, providing banking and finance and trade. These pictures, if anybody knows Lincoln, the one you can see here with the nice Romanesque windows that hasn't been knocked about too much, is just simply called the Jew's House. It is now a restaurant. And before that, it was an antique shop. You can see it's on a road called, unsurprisingly, Steep Hill, and this is Jews' Court. Unfortunately, the windows have been ruined, and new stuff has been put in the 19th and 20th century. but this was clearly a very substantial building for the medieval period, probably built in about 1870. And archaeologically, I understand the synagogue sat really just behind Jews' Court and the Jews' house. So, having been responsible for trade in the ancient world, rather like the Phoenicians had before, throughout the Levant, by the time you get to the First Crusade in 1096 to 1099, you already have a situation where the kind of the mercantile role of the Jews in medieval society was being taken over increasingly by Christians. And so what we see in the First Crusade is that there was the competition for the lucrative trade that went through the Levant, this important trade between East and West, which had previously been the province of the Jews, was now coveted and seized by Christian kings. And the First Crusade established a series of Crusader states to dominate the trade routes through the Levant in the period after 1099. It's interesting to note as well that in 1096, that the First Crusade was also accompanied by the butchery of hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout Europe as peasants were attacked Jewish homes and sacked them. So you can see that this was a substantial building, probably built in 1170. By 1290, all the Jews in England had either been forced to leave or killed or forced to convert to Christianity. A process which took place in the 13th century in France, in the 14th century in Germany, and of course the 15th century in Spain. What you see, for example, in Al-Andalus, the Caliphate in Spain and Portugal, was that the Jews constituted a kind of equal partner with the Moors, the Muslims, in the context of the Iberian Peninsula. And although, for example, Jews would have been taxed at maybe a differential rate, for example, compared to Muslims, the point was that the Muslims did, the Jews played that particular role of trade and banking in the context of medieval Europe. For a long time, up until 1290, Jews first came to Britain in 1066 with William the Conqueror, as again bankers, merchants, and traders, and were protected explicitly by the king because the Jews constituted a valuable source of revenue for the crown. They would extract higher taxes from Jewish merchants, and the term merchant became almost synonymous with Jew in this context. So the level of development of the market. Now, remember here, we're not here talking about capitalism in the modern sense, but of mercantile trade and production of goods for the market, as opposed to a natural economy where things were produced simply to satisfy one's own personal needs, and one just simply sells the small surplus in the market. Instead, all production goes over to the market. So one of the things that you see in England, for example, is the development of the wool trade as a world commodity. And it's that wool trade that was so highly lucrative. What easier way can there be to get rid of one's creditors than simply kill them? In the context of England, there wasn't really a conflict between feudal lords, peasants, and the Jews up until 1290. There had been pogroms before that in Lincoln in 1195, I think. But there was no conflict because feudal lords did what feudal lords did. They exploited peasants. Peasants did what peasants did. They scratched about in the soil and grew crops, and gave over part of their produce to the lord, or gave over compulsory labor to the lord. There was no conflict between either of those castes, as it were, and the Jews, who occupied a particular stratum in the early medieval part of history. And so this development of trade and of production for the market was more advanced, for example, in England than it was in France and in Germany and in Spain. And so the expulsion of the Jews follows the development of the market in these various areas. So the importance of this is that this, if one listens to Zionists or whatever else talking about the place of Jews in society, that they've always somehow been hated by Christians, and there's always been a deep antipathy between Jew and Muslim, Jew and Christian, it certainly isn't true in history. You see in Al-Andalus, for example, a flourishing of Jewish history and art and literature and science, along with Muslim art and literature and science. They were, as it were, partners in the project, as indeed they were, as the Jews were in medieval Europe in the early part of the feudal period. So Jews were concerned with the development of mercantile capital and put bluntly, usury, lending money at interest. So by 1290, all Jews were expelled from England and not really readmitted until Cromwell's Commonwealth, the oldest continuously used synagogue in England at the moment is Bevis Marx, which was opened in 1707. And Bevis Marx was a Sephardic synagogue. The first wave of Jews allowed back into England tended to be Sephardic Jews, so Jews from Spain and Portugal, and to a certain extent from North Africa. What happened to the rest of the Jews? What we see is an eastward move into more where feudalism remained intact. An interesting feature about Judaism throughout the early medieval period was that it was also a proselytizing religion. And after all, in the ancient world, as far as monotheism was concerned, it was the only game in town. And so we see, for example, sometimes the ruling class of a particular society would convert to Judaism because of its relationship to trade. Khazaria, the area around the Caspian Sea, which was a Jewish kingdom, as it were, was an area which was where the ruling class had converted to Judaism. And conversion to Judaism was widespread throughout the Hellenistic world, throughout the ancient world, and to a certain extent throughout the early medieval part of history. However, as the growth of the market meant that increasingly production is for exchange of world commodities on a world market, the Jews are effectively forced eastwards into the pores of Polish society, into the pores of those parts of the world that are still basically feudal. And it's only then you start to get the growth of what we might call modern anti-Semitism. So whilst Jews had gone through periods where they'd been usurped, had their property stolen by feudal lords, we're not talking about anti-Semitism in the modern sense. And we'll come on to that now. So as Abraham Leon puts it, the Jewish masses find themselves wedged between the anvil of decaying feudalism and the hammer of rotting capitalism. Even before the division of Poland between the Soviet Union and Germany, there was widespread anti-Semitism in Poland even before World War II. And Zionism, of course, was a particular response to anti-Semitism. In the early, whilst the the role of the Jews as a trading nation in the context of Western Europe declined, and it thrived for a period in Eastern Europe. And what Abraham Leon argues is that as the market encroached increasingly into Eastern Europe, the Jews started to be forced out of even that position there. And so instead of being well-respected traders and merchants and bankers, instead they were forced often into the kind of petty huckstering of pawnbroking or petty trade or selling small goods and petty usury. And from that point of view, it's then that they become in conflict with Polish and other farmers, peasants, and so on. And from that point of view, modern anti-Semitism starts to become a feature of Poland long before World War II. So Zionism itself in 19th century is a 19th century response to anti-Semitism. Theodor Herzl wrote The Jewish State in 1896. Most East European Jews in the early part of in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century were either members of the Bund, the Social Democratic Jewish Workers' Bund, or were members of socialist or communist parties. And that fascism, we've seen quite a bit of debate about Israel, for example, being called fascist by a number of people. As I've made a point on more than one occasion, I think fascism, the term fascism, is best reserved for that particular period in the 1920s and 30s, when there was a particular concatenation of events where you had the potential for a revolutionary proletariat which could take power, a petty bourgeoisie, whether it's Polish or German, that was often maybe in debt to Jewish lenders, and on the other hand, a haute bourgeoisie. So the petty bourgeoisie were crushed, as it were, between big capital on the one hand and a potentially revolutionary proletariat on the other. And from that point of view, the anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe throughout the Russian Empire was a feature of their particular position into which the Jews had been pushed as a direct consequence of losing their place, which they'd previously enjoyed in the context of early medieval period and subsequently throughout Western Europe. So just to conclude then, as we saw, most Jews were outside of, were part of the diaspora long before the sacking of the Second Temple in 70 AD, and had effectively been forced eastwards and were a proselytizing religion on the way. Very few Jews at all were Zionists before 1945, and even those that were, very few actually emigrated to Palestine. Insofar as Jews emigrated at all, and they did so in very large numbers, they tended to emigrate, first of all, from the countryside into the cities. And so the Jewish population became an urban population. And moreover, where they did emigrate outside of, for example, Poland, the preferred destination was the United States, Britain, Canada, and almost anywhere but Palestine. Only a few religious Jews were emigrating to Palestine in the period after the First World War. And that particular series of events is something that we'll address in further sessions in this series. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Could you stop sharing screen, please, comrade? Thank you so much. That was really a whirlwind through all of history there of how the Jewish people developed. That was really interesting. Comrades, if you want to get involved in asking or ask a question, make a contribution, remember there are no stupid questions, no wrong questions, and we are all here to learn. And I'm going to ask a stupid one now straight away. So the development, I mean, you touched on it, obviously, Marx and Engels as well, but Marx in particular in his essay, that was, you say, language obviously changes all the time. So this is a reflection of language changing. It is the missing context, etc. So throughout, ever since Marx died and became a tool as well, used by the left, but also used by the right. It's come up and down, isn't it? This accusation that he is actually anti-Semitic. Have you seen this being visited through in this period where Corbyn, the whole left, Corbyn, they are all anti-Semites? Have you seen this charge?
There's been quite a few articles written about how Marx was both racist and anti-Semitic. Racist is an interesting accusation. It almost entirely is based upon Marx using the term nigger at a time when lots of people did, and it wasn't meant as a racial slur. Certainly, there have been quite a few articles written about Marx as an anti-Semite, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, just consider this. I mean, Eleanor Marx, who his daughter, actually embraced her father's Jewish heritage and learned Yiddish so she could work among a lot of workers in East London were, particularly women, were working in the textile industry in sweated trades and spoke Yiddish. And Eleanor Marx, who'd never spoken a word of Yiddish, taught herself Yiddish. I mean, she was an extraordinarily capable woman. She taught herself Norwegian just so she could read the works of Henrik Ibsen, and taught herself Yiddish so that she could help organize Jewish workers in sweated trades in East London. There was no sense of any kind of hostility to Judaism as such. It was an understanding of the why the Jewish people were taken up, were in the position in society that they were. I mean, once you understand that, all sorts of other things become intelligible. I mean, if you go and watch The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, I mean, it's interesting that, of course, it's The Merchant of Venice. It's not The Merchant of East London, because there were no Jews. Shakespeare would never have met a Jewish person. And neither would anyone in his audience, because they'd all been killed or thrown or forced out of the country. But Judaism in this context, in the context of The Merchant of Venice, was another way of referring to capitalism. And it's in that context that really Marx is talking about Judaism. Now, this is not to say that Marx is in any way suggesting that the Jews are responsible for capitalism. That is a slur which is put forward by Werner Sombart, among others, who tried to argue. I mean, Werner Sombart had been a socialist and moved over to being a fascist by the late 1930s, and tried to argue that the Jews were, as it were, responsible for capitalism. He was an associate also of Max Weber, who also tried to assign to religion, but in his case of Protestantism, of bringing capitalism into being. And of course, for Marx, it's the other way around. It's the economic conditions that throw up the form taken by religion. So the form. It's interesting to speculate as to why monotheism grows up when it does, in terms of the development of world markets. I read one historian also of the Quran, whose name escapes me at the moment, but makes a similar point that Islam was also concerned with the question around trade. And monotheism, of course, is once you're dealing with the market, you're dealing with a universal. Everybody's labor becomes commensurable with everybody else's labor. Perhaps ultimately all becomes commensurable with gold or silver, which can take the form of money. Really, monotheism represents a universalism that becomes a feature of bourgeois society. But even before capitalism is associated with trade. But there are certainly people out there writing relatively recent rubbish about how Marx was a raging anti-Semite, and therefore it's what you'd expect of the left. And of course, what also makes it difficult is the fact that we know there was widespread anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union. So the famous doctor's plot, for example, shortly before the death of Stalin, was an implication that rootless cosmopolitans who didn't really owe their allegiance to the Soviet Union or to Russia were behind attempts to poison Stalin and so on.
I've read something very briefly about, apparently it's not quite, it's controversial why Jewish people or the Jewish people class were in that position that they, ended up in finance, etc., traders quite so much. I mean, the usual, and you touched on that, obviously, the usual thing, in the medieval times in particular, Jews were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to do the guilds, join the guilds, so they were pushed into financing. They were the only people really who could do financing, and then they became good at it. This is now sort of, by some historians, Jewish historians, Zionist, pro-Zionist historians, been questioned. That it's not then capitalism that turns around and makes that into something quite useful, etc. But it's actually Jewish people sort of worked really hard, and they just applied themselves, and they spent more time on educating themselves and were good with figures, etc. And that's why they've become such a leading force within banking and finance, etc. It's got nothing to do with the sort of previous history. Well, I think there's probably a bit of both going on, but where do you see how it's still relevant, how it's still, there are relatively a lot of Jewish people still in finance and in banking, etc.
Abraham Leon addresses this quite explicitly. What he also points out, for example, is that Christians were often simply not allowed to go into banking, not because simply because in a feudal society you stuck to your stratum, as it were. So if you wanted to go into banking, you would be expected to be Jewish. And yes, Jews were prevented from going into the guilds, for example, but so were, for example, people who were déclassé Christians, impoverished Christians, or Christians from some other background, or foreigners or whatever else, would also be prevented from going into the guilds. And from that point of view, it was part of the stratification of the ancient world more than a kind of the typical story is that the Jews were forced to take up usury because it was a sin for Christians to engage in usury. In fact, what Leon is arguing is that usury was a feature of trade. If you're engaged in trade, then you're lending money, and of course that's exactly what we see in The Merchant of Venice, isn't it? So the Christian trader is lent money by Shylock, and he whimsically suggests that his interest will be a pound of flesh taken from the merchant's heart if he doesn't pay up on time. And of course he's going to pay up on time because he's a man of his honor, and so on and so forth. But then the ship's are wrecked in a storm, and Shylock will have his pound of flesh. What Shakespeare is talking about is the rapacity of capitalism, not the rapaciousness of Jews. And by the way, Abraham Leon's not saying that all Jews were rich either, merely that Jews were connected with trade one way or another, and that connection with trade might well be as stevedores, as tailors or whatever else, that were often themselves at the margins.
Do you see similarities? Because listening to yourself sort of popped into my head that, the same way that Christianity, as a sort of what started as a rebellion, a religion of rebellion, and was put down by the ruling class and was, tried to stop it, and they, killed Jesus, whoever he was, or whichever people he was, rebellions, you know, running, starting up everywhere, etc. And then they took it over. And then they actually noticed that actually the ruling class, we can use this, we can use it, make it our own, turn it on its head, etc. Something similar seems to have gone on there. You know, you push Jews to the side, etc. And then there's a recognition actually for the development of capitalism. This is useful. We can make this our own, and we can, you know, we can take this over to a degree. And perhaps that explains a few things.
Yes, by the time of Constantine, Christianity was no longer really the religion of the poor and dispossessed, but had become an expression of that same universalism that was trade. And from that point of view, that constitutes a period when there was a competition between Judaism and Christianity. Of course, you can even see elements of, I mean, it's an argument. I'm not a theologian. I don't know a great deal about it. But if you compare, for example, the synoptic gospels, the first three gospels, they're quite different to the Gospel of St. John. And one argument is that this later gospel was an effort to distance Christians from the rebelliousness of Jews in the Levant. From that point of view, to help pave the way for an acceptance of Christianity within the Roman Empire.
Thank you, Ian. Ian, yeah, Ian. Yes, you are, Ian. There's another Ian in the audience. I just got confused. Sorry. Okay, comrades, if you have a question or want to make a contribution, please click raise hand. We've got Tony first.
Yeah.
Hi, Tony.
Yeah, hi, Tina. Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for an extremely comprehensive talk, really covering a vast expanse of history all in 1 hour. It's in many ways quite amazing. So really, I've just got a few short things. The first thing is, I was surprised you actually didn't mention Moses Hess, who was a fellow of Marx and who is alleged to have inspired on the Jewish question. I'd be interested for your comments on that. I mean, there've been whole books written. I mean, this one in particular, I don't know whether you've read it, Julius Karlbach. He's a Sussex, he's dead now, Sussex University historian, the radical critique, Karl Marx and the radical critique of Judaism, where a whole book is written on why Marx is anti-Semitic based on this one essay. I mean, it has been exploited mercilessly, including, of course, the use of language taken totally out of context. And I think that's the point that needs to be made, that, I mean, things like "to Jew," for example, was a quite common expression 100 years ago. It wasn't anti-Semitic. In Brighton now, we have a Jew street still. I mean, this was extremely common, but of course, if you take something out of its historical context, and you can make virtually anybody anti-Semitic. And Leon, he summed up this really in his book, and it is a classic, and I think people really should read it, when he said Zionism transposes modern anti-Semitism to all of history and saves itself the trouble of studying the various forms of anti-Semitism and their evolution. And that's the point. For Zionism, anti-Semitism is an ahistorical phenomena. It's always been there, always will be there, and ultimately it's because of the Jew themselves. I mean, why else would anti-Semitism exist? There must be something about a Jew which produces anti-Semitism wherever he or she goes. This is the bankrupt logic of Zionism, which we're now seeing playing out in Gaza, to be quite honest, because it does have quite lethal consequences, this idea that we're always a victim. The Holocaust was just one stage in a very long-running play. And you see, for example, I mean, the demonization of the Palestinians and Muslims there, because I mean, Zionism is an important part of Islamophobia, and I mean, it does need to be emphasized and re-emphasized in many ways that when Christian anti-Semitism, feudal anti-Semitism occurred in Europe, Jews also fled to North Africa. Moses Maimonides, the most famous religious philosopher, he fled, he became Saladin's personal physician, for example. And as you said, the Palestinians themselves, if anyone is the direct descendant of the ancient Hebrews, it's not the European settlers who came in, it's the Palestinians themselves. And there's a lot of evidence in terms of rituals and so on, like lighting candles on a Friday night and so on, to suggest the Palestinians do have that direct lineage before they converted first to Christianity and then to Muslims. But I think the main thing, I mean, Marx's essay was a brilliant prefiguring of Abraham Leon in a sense, because he seized on the essential. The religion survived because of the Jews. The Jews didn't survive because of their religion, which is what, of course, the rabbis and religious philosophers say. But I think the most important differentiation we can make between modern anti-Semitism and feudal or ancient anti-Semitism is in the past, when you had a peasant rebellion because they wanted to burn the creditor notes and so on, the Jews had issued. This was an anti-Semitism from below, whereas modern anti-Semitism, whether it was from the Tsarist regime or Hitler, the Nazis, it came from above, and it was a conscious attempt to divide and rule, amongst other things, and it ended up, of course, in the Holocaust. But today we see how that has been exploited in order to perpetuate further genocide. Thank you.
Yes, I was fascinated about the various promissory notes, for example, that existed. So if you had a Jewish moneylender in early medieval England in particular, the promissory notes would be stored in a particular place, and the peasants would, of course, want to seize hold of that and burn the promissory notes. and of course, in so doing, many Jews were killed. One of the interesting things about the kings of England, they looked after themselves because quite often, even if they seized the promissory notes, even though the creditor was killed, the king said, well, because the Jews are effectively the property of the crown, you've got to pay the crown what you would have been paying the Jews.
Yeah.
The Jewish population was as far as the kings of England were concerned, and the kings of France, and indeed the various kind of kingdoms within Germany, were people to be shaken down every now and then and taxed in a particular way. And it was that was the price that the Jewish people had to pay to be able to operate that business. On the question of Moses Hess, I don't know a vast amount about him. I do know, of course, he was an early associate of Marx and Engels, and but of course was a kind of socialist Zionist, which of course Marx and Engels could have no truck with whatsoever. There was also
Roman Jerusalem, which was the first Zionist pamphlet, in fact. Yeah.
Oh, go on, tell me a bit more about that. That's interesting.
It was in 1861 he wrote it. I mean, he wasn't a socialist by then, because he said quite clearly that race is primary, class is secondary. But he prefigured Theodor Herzl by over 30 years. He had become, but he was a Zionist without a Zionist movement. I mean, that's the point. That's why he made virtually no impact on history, whereas Herzl gathered round him a movement. So that was why it was different. He was before his time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as I understand it, the Zionism of Herzl was really a kind of response to the kind of intensifying pogroms that were taking place within the Russian Empire and so on. Of course, you also notice a difference in the Jewish population of England changed, of course, as well, because the early after the Commonwealth allowed Jews back in were mostly Sephardic and actually generally better off. And of course, Benjamin Disraeli was one of those, but of course he converted to the Church of England by then, and so he could assume his political role. Later Jews, towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, tended to be Ashkenazim, and were invariably poorer. And so what you got in East London, for example, was a very a Yiddish culture, which had its own theatres, its own newspapers, And I could, in a sense, I just caught the tail end of that when I was living in East London. You would meet people who could still speak Yiddish and so on. But what seems to have happened is where, for example, British Jews had assimilated and become proletarians, they stopped being Jewish. Where they'd stayed in business or whatever else, then they moved out to Golders Green or Hackney or whatever else.
Thank you, Tony. Felicity, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Ian. That was very interesting. And a little aside, I have one of my uncles, great uncle, was a genealogist, lived in the United States, emigrated there, I think his parents at the beginning of last century. And he wrote a history of 1,000 years of my father's family in Europe. So I have a history of 1,000 years of, so you're really accurate. I mean, that is very accurate. And also the pogroms, I think we mustn't forget things like the pogroms of Russia and what have you, but also my father's family also came from, I mean, they were Ashkenazi. And for example, I have 100% European genetics. So a lot of Ashkenazi Jews and maybe other Jews, the Sephardic, actually don't have any Middle Eastern genetic heritage, which is an irony because they say it's their natural home. But I think it's something like 2% of, and also I had a relative of my mother, well, my mother married a number of times, but I had a relative of my mother whose father was the doctor at the court of Egypt, who was Jewish, Palestinian, and said Jew and Arab live very happily together, in harmony. Of course, the ratios were different, I think in the 20s or the 30s or something like, oh, no, earlier than that. But also my father's family were intellectuals from Kiev, what is now Kiev, no, sorry, not Kiev, Lvov, which is now Lviv in Ukraine. So there was, I don't think you can say there was a homogenous, that the Jews in Europe were this homogenous. I know you had kind of shtetl Jews, and they were the Jews who had Yiddish, and they had the theatres and so on and so forth. But I think you can't say that they were a homogenous group. They were very different. I mean, I don't know what Tony thinks, but anyway, yeah, that's all I wanted to say, a little aside. Oh, and thank you. And also Marx. I think that Marx wasn't talking necessarily about, I think for Marx, my understanding of his writings is that he saw any religion as something deflecting, keeping people down and keeping people, usurping power from people. So that's how I read it. I don't read it that he was, how can he be anti-Semitic? It's like, he was a Jew. I just hate that whole thing of you're a self-hating Jew. It's bizarre. I mean, I support the Palestinians, so I know Zionists would call me a self-hating Jew. They call Tony a self-hating Jew. They call anybody else who's Jewish and has a different viewpoint. That I mean, I'm an atheist, but I still have the extraction. Was I in any country where they didn't like Jews or people from Jewish extraction? But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Marx and Engels were certainly not hostile to religion, any religions really. They didn't regard it in kind of functionalist terms. I think they regarded it as it's something that would wither away in time, rather than being something that needs to be suppressed or even criticized severely. I mean, you don't see a sense of criticism. I mean, it's quite interesting if you look at photographs of the Marx daughters. I think one or two of them were wearing crucifixes. I think it was Laura was wearing a crucifix, and one of they weren't hostile to religion, and as I say, Eleanor positively embraced her Jewish heritage.
And they also
the other response, of course, to from the 18th century was mysticism. So rather than concentrating on the Talmud, the Kabbalah. So you end up with the mystical kind of tradition, and you see that a little bit with some Haredi Jews today, and an interest in that side of things. So, and as we've seen, people like many Haredi Jews will regard Israel as not only murderous but blasphemous with it.
A lot of Marxists think, if somebody says they're religious, they have to go and throw that's stupid. Don't be stupid, and don't believe in God. It's so clearly not true, etc. Marx and Engels had a much more sophisticated approach than that. I think they explained it in a material way, but they also that famous quote. It's not just religion is the opium for the people. It goes on at some length, and they're explaining it's also the heart in a heartless world, the soul and soulless conditions. They explain why people turn to religion even then, but it would still work today, wouldn't it? It's actually a very good sophisticated and understanding approach to religion, which I always thought is amazing. Agnes next.
Did it work?
Yeah, you're there.
Wonderful. And Ian, thank you very much for your very, really very interesting talk. Of course, Marx wasn't anti-Semitic. In the 19th century, especially in the middle and a little bit later, I think it was pretty fashionable to kind of write so-called anti-Semitic essays and so on. But these people were like armchair philosophers or armchair anti-Semites, but they were not really practicing anti-Semites. And I just like to bring up Richard Wagner, because he is the same period, and he is supposed to be horrendously anti-Semitic. And I mean, Hitler adopted him, and that makes it even worse. But yes, Wagner wrote some pretty horrific things about Jews. On the other hand, I mean, his life work was his compositions, The Ring and Parsifal and those operas, and he entrusted them to Hermann Levy, a Jewish conductor, not anybody else. And it was Hermann Levy who premiered all these works. So this is really my point, that it's a different kind of anti-Semitism, but it's not practical, because in practice, as far as I can tell, in practice, Wagner wasn't anti-Semitic. He was just writing a lot of rubbish. Okay, and thank you again, Ian, for your very interesting talk.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Agnes.
If you read Martin Luther, you find a lot of anti-Semitism there and all. And it's an interesting one. There's a magnificent essay by Friedrich Engels, The Peasant War in Germany. And I always used to recommend this as an antidote to reading Max Weber on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. If you really want to understand the Reformation, religious ideas in transformation are an expression of a transformation in society. The growth of the market in Germany was an expression of was expressed in a form which was Lutheran Protestantism, which was anti-Semitic, and it was a reflection of the change in the economic base of society. Yeah.
Peter next, please.
Thank you. Apologies, first of all, because we missed the beginning of your talk, but my question hopefully is a simple one. I just wanted to, if you could clarify the relationship between Jews that were trading in Moorish Spain, where they were they traded through usury, while Moors were against the idea of usury.
Indeed, and similarly in Europe, but I think again it's one argument is that the Jews were usurers because the Moors were not allowed to do usury, and that's still a feature of Islam today. You can only have a certain percentage. But the other argument, and I think the one that Abraham Leon puts forward, is that actually it's a reflection of the position of the Jews in society. The Moors did what feudal lords did. They exploited peasants. The Jews had that particular place in Al-Andalus, in the Caliphate in Iberia, rather than it being well, we can't do usury, so we'll let you do it. But they were kind of equal partners, as it were. I know, just in the same ways that you had in early feudal England, the Moors would extract taxes from the Jews in Al-Andalus, but they weren't being kind of persecuted or suppressed, or no religious ideas. If anyone gets the opportunity, there are only 3 surviving synagogues in Spain. The best one is in Toledo, and you can see it was quite a sumptuous building. They obviously had a very important part to play in Andalusian society, in Al-Andalus, so that's all of Spain, right up to the very northern bit, name which escapes me, where they drink cider, and so right up until the so-called Reconquista, and even then, the Christian kings initially tolerated the Jews for a period for the same kinds of reasons. That they were able to shake them down on a regular basis and extract taxes from them. It's not some sort of idea that Muslims were. There is a kind of a Quranic feature where you don't the early Islam was not interested in persecuting other people of the book, Christians and Jews, but in fact people who were pagans, polytheists. But the Jews and the Moors in Spain were kind of co-partners, as it were.
Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, it's an interesting discussion. I thought the talk was very interesting. I disagree possibly with some of the emphasis on some of it. I mean, I think that Marx's essay was a precursor of what Leon actually wrote, and I've done a lot of sort of been influenced a lot by Abraham Leon in terms of politics and understanding of Zionism and the Jewish question, etc., etc. I mean, I think it's a mistake to see this. I think Leon himself explicitly attacked the idea at some point. I can't remember exactly where in his book, that the Jews were simply crudely forced into usury and business and money making and all this sort of thing by religious persecution and religious prohibitions. I think it's a bit more complex than that. I mean, it's about feudal. That Christianity was originally. In antiquity, it might have been the religion of the poor, but as when antiquity was effectively overcome, and you saw the growth of feudalism, the church became the center of feudalism. The church became the core, not exactly the core of the ruling class, but certainly a very large part of what drove feudalism as a system. And I think the Jews were a phenomena, part of a phenomena that's actually quite common throughout other parts of the world, except it wasn't necessarily Jews who were in that position. You see Chinese people in other parts of Asia, in Africa later. You saw Indians, etc., playing a trading role. And I think the peoples were traditionally. The Jews were trading people in antiquity. I mean, that is documented. There were others who disappeared, Phoenicians or whatever, but the Jews survived. And I think that the reason they survived is they were able to get into a particular niche in the emerging feudal society. And And they were not money lenders to start with. I mean, I'm sure they did lend money, but their main role was international trade, you know, and the feudal ruling classes were much more local. But the thing that the people who actually were able to, you know, move things around and buy and sell on an international basis were the Jews, because of their prior history as a commercial population. And of course, there's the diaspora and the whole emigration thing as well, you know. But it's not simply true that they were simply forced into by religious prohibition into becoming usurers. You know, I think that's a bit of a a bit of a reductionist view. I mean, I think Marx's work is not about race. It's about religion, and it's about the influence of the secular material world on religion, and the way it's the way that finds reflection in religion. And Marx had been very well aware of the trading role of the Jews and the roles of, you know, particularly in the earlier period and in the later period when it's basically, it was capitalism. The Jews were not a capitalist group. They were, as a people class, they were not capitalists. They embodied commercial capital, not productive capital. They don't produce surplus value. They're a trade. You know, it's trade. You buy from one place and sell at a profit in another place, but there's no actual inputs in terms of production. You know, so it wasn't capitalist production. And when capitalist production came on the scene, it started to drive the Jews out of the merchants period. That's when they were forced into usury. You know, that is Leon's theory, really. The forcing them into the financial sector was a later product of their social role, as capitalism actually pushed them out. You know, so it's a funny sort of paradox, really, that the Jews were pushed out of their previous pre-capitalist position by the rise of capitalism, and they were persecuted in that last period, in the later period of feudalism, and that laid the basis for that capitalism, in the sense that actually it both forced the persecution, and it emancipated the Jews when it actually came to power and destroyed the feudal system in France, to a degree in England, actually, you know. And in the 19th century, that was the emancipation of Jews, the full development of capitalism, you know. So I think it's there is a reading back in history of prejudices of today in branding Marx's writings as anti-Semitic, because what he's doing is he's simply commenting on what was the social norm in that period, and what he came from a Jewish background. He understood very well what the religion was based on, and it was, as he said, it's the real Jew that made the religion, not the religion that made the Jew. It was a social role that they were forced to play that modified the religion and made it what it was. Sorry, I know I'm being asked to wind up now, so I probably could. Yeah, okay, I'll leave it there. But hopefully that makes some sense. Anyway, thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. That was interesting.
Could I come in?
Yes, just a second. Did you want us to reply to Ian anything, or can we bring it?
No, I'll just make a little input, if I may. And then I do have a couple of questions for Ian. So thanks for promoting me. I don't know if I should say thanks, to become a panelist. I was in the audience, and I had a few questions for Ian, which I'll come to. They're very small and minor. But I might say, sitting here in Johannesburg, South Africa, 2 hours later than you, so it's already getting on for 10:30. I go to bed late, always, midnight, but I've had one hell of a day on the Gaza issue and Zionists attacking me as self-hating Jew and so on, having to deal with that, as we all have to. But the one thing I did want to say and make maybe a couple of points. Growing up in South Africa, my grandparents were Ashkenazi from Lithuania, 1900 or so. My father was actually 1 year old when he came out. My mother was already born here. And there was
a working class Jewish sector here, almost like the East End of London, but socially mobile upwards as they managed to accrue in South Africa's white people a higher status. And I had some awful uncles who had become so uppity. One of my first, my one uncle was the first Jew in South Africa to join the apartheid National Party in something like 1950, the year before my bar mitzvah. And he was going to speak at my bar mitzvah, and I refused. I said to my father, no way, he's joining the National Party. Already become a little bit conscious at that stage through having a very, very kind parents, working class parents, and a communist cousin who ultimately was arrested for high treason with Mandela and others. What I wanted to say about the so-called anti-Semitism of Marx, it was never a feature here in South Africa, except if you went to a university or in high school and you were beginning to get a little interested, as a few of us did, then a very right-wing, usually teacher or a professor out of England would say, noticing that there were Jewish boys interested, a couple of us, Karl Marx was an anti-Semite. So, you know, we'd go and look it up and ask a few people to give us guidance, and it was quite simple, actually, to realize he wasn't. And all the points that Ian has made was provided to us by comrades in the Communist Party, like my cousin and others. The interesting thing is that the young Turks of the ANC, no less than Nelson Mandela, by the way, who, as they began in the 1940s to exert a militancy out of what had been a very moderate ANC and came along with a very outstanding program of action, they suddenly found that a lot of black people, working class blacks, were communist in their outlook. And therefore, for a couple of years before they came to realize the nonsense they spoke, they said that, well, Marxism is a foreign ideology and it's European, it's brought here by the whites. They gave that up very quickly because they were very sensible, and they began to realize what the Communist Party was, and the Jews from the party, who, the Joe Slovos and others who were so committed. The nationalists of the PAC, the more right-wing, kept on with that line for many years. Today, they wouldn't mention it anymore. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. Also, the second point I wanted to say for this evening is that the crisis now facing the Palestinians, and of course the whole genocidal aspect, as in Britain, everybody now wants to know what the hell Zionism is, more and more. And when Tony, I follow Tony all the time, and I saw this series coming on, I thought, I've got to come in. I was in it last week, Tony, and I'm glad to see you're a little better. You were pretty ill last week, comrade, eh? But we really have such an opportunity now, and I know you obviously realize it yourselves, but here in South Africa, our BDS groups, Palestine Solidarity, which have been very small, at times becoming very energetic with the crises. We had 200,000 people in Cape Town marching a week ago, because mainly of Muslim working class people in Cape Town. We got middle class Muslims in Durban and Joburg, Pretoria. But yesterday we had a tremendous march in Johannesburg as well. It's all over South Africa, but at the ideological level, people are really wanting to know and understand the question of Zionism. And I've been struggling for years when I was a minister under no less a president than Thabo Mbeki, a highly intellectual person, might have been criticized for certain things. You're not going into that, but I used to find it so frustrating in cabinet, and not just with him, getting our leading people to understand that Zionism was at the root of the problem in relation to Israel. It's only now that they're beginning to realize the absolute danger of it, given the genocide at this point in time. And Tony, I'm trying to influence comrades to join in this wonderful series that you have, but I'm afraid very, very, very busy at the moment. Okay, thanks for the time. I'm coming down to some very simple questions for Ian. Ian, I came in as you were talking about the roots of anti-Semitism in medieval times and earlier, and you talked about the first Jews arriving in England in the 10th century. And I was amazed at that, and I wondered where they had originated. Were they Sephardis? Had they come through from Iberia? It's that kind of movement that I'm pretty interested in. And then the second question, where you mentioned the Khazari kingdom in the Caspian Sea. I've read Shlomo Sand, and I really promote that book to so many people here. It's absolutely outstanding, especially to Jewish comrades, and we're beginning to get a new generation of young Jews becoming involved. So we have an organization, South African Jews for Palestine, etc. And they played quite a remarkable role yesterday in the Joburg March, by the way. Every time a young Jew or an older Jew, I don't speak as a Jew anymore. I'm more of a broader, rounded character. But every time, whether it's the Cape Town March, the Joburg March, when a person of a Jewish identity who's very recently involved stands up, and we push them and promote them, and they say they are Jewish and what Israel's doing is not in their name, the crowd goes absolutely wild with applause. It's very, very interesting. The Khazari issue then, Ian, what actually happened to those people? I'm aware of the conversion of Jews from an early period of time, people converting into Judaism, or Judaism converting pagans and other people. But I'm interested in the Khazari in terms of where they went. So the Russian Jews, and as I've said, that's my background, and I spoke a bit of Russian as a kid through my grandparents, as well as Yiddish, by the way. It's viewed as though the Russian Jews tended to come from Central Europe, and that direction. But surely the Khazari who had converted also must have moved into Greater Russia, etc. So is that a mix in Russia in relation to the hundreds of people, several million, in fact, who became Jewish? Thanks.
Thanks, Ronnie, and thanks for coming on as a panelist. Ian, do you want to reply?
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. As far as I'm aware, the Jews that came across with William the Conqueror in 1066 were Jews that were already in Europe. So that's an illustration of the extent of the diaspora. Whether they'd come from Khazaria, which is what one of the hypotheses put forward by Shlomo Sands, is that the Khazar Jews had migrated into Europe. But I think, I'm not sure they would have been Sephardic, because they weren't expelled from Al-Andalus until much later. So my guess is that they were either people who had converted to Judaism already in Europe, or possibly migrants from Khazaria. But I'm not an expert. I can't say for sure. Just want to make one other little thing about something Ian said about other groups forming, say, a stratum within African society, for example. So you had a number of people who were, so quite a lot of Asians living in Africa in, for example, Uganda and Kenya. And that, I think, as I understand it, that what's different there is that these groups, as with in South Africa as well, I understand, Asians were often invited by British colonial administrations, British imperialist administrations, to either make up a particular part of a workforce or to make up or to occupy positions within the imperial civil service, and therefore occupied a particular position within, for example, Uganda and Kenya and indeed South Africa, and sometimes earned the resentment of African nationalist regimes because they occupied a kind of relatively privileged place relative to Black Africans. But that's quite different to the kind of position that was occupied by the Jews in early medieval Europe, who were this, as you've already, as Ian said, in line with Abraham Leon, occupied a people class. Right.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Ronnie. And we actually have quite an international audience, which is good because we're all fighting the same fight, and this is a really good time to come together and share experience and develop our understanding together. So good to see you. See you soon, hopefully. William, please.
Yeah. Now, the Jews in Ireland have not had a bad history. They've had an excellent history. There was always only a handful of Jews up until around 1900. And then with some of the pogroms that they had in Lithuania and in the Baltic countries, they were driven out and they ended up in Ireland. Now, they centered around, mostly around the South Circular Road, around six streets of houses they settled. And they had their own little community there, which was accepted by everybody because they brought in, well, first of all, they brought in a variety of bread that the natives weren't used to, and then they brought in butcher shops that the natives weren't used to, and then the garment factories, garments, they were able to maintain garments and things like that. Now, they were very poor to begin with, and probably one of the best examples of a Dublin Jew would be reading Ulysses by James Joyce, because Leopold Bloom, who is the main character in Ulysses, was a Dublin Jew. And there's no mention of anti-Semitism in Ulysses at all. As a matter of fact, Leopold Bloom had a ball of a time when he was in Dublin. Now, it's the part of Dublin I come from myself, and my father would have been very close to the Jewish population, the Jewish community, because the Jewish community, it's the only place in Europe that I know of where the Jews actually organized themselves during the Nazi period. And when the Irish Nazis were starting off, and they were starting off, it was the Jews that organized the boxing club in the Hungry 30s and were able to put money into it to get equipment and gloves and all sorts of other things that's needed for boxing. And it's other progressive elements in the area, including my father. My father would have been in the FINA, which was the youth wing of the IRA at the time. And they all joined, and they used to wait for the Nazis, which were called the Blue Shirts. Now, the Blue Shirts are in government in Ireland at the moment. Fine Gael are the Blue Shirts. Now, they try and hide that they're not, but they were in the 1930s, and they were able to deal with them, no problem. Now, there was one program in Ireland, a program against Jews, that was in Limerick, and it was nasty, and it was in 1912. And that was after some religious zealots from the Catholic Church started going on about the Jews were the ones that crucified Christ, and we should get our own back on behalf of Christ and crucify them. And that sort of thing happened. And that was the only instance that I know in Ireland where there has been anti-Semitism. The actual Jewish community assimilated really very well into Ireland. There's Jews in the judiciary, there's Jews in medical, there's a lot of them went into medicine. And some of them are just ordinary working class Jews, and they didn't they went to the ordinary jobs. Now, also there's a synagogue in Dublin that the Dubliners say is the only Hitler-built synagogue in the world. Now, how that came about was Dublin was bombed by the Luftwaffe in 1941. Initially, they said it wasn't the Luftwaffe, it was the RAF, because they assumed, the Germans assumed that we'd believe that. And a lot of people at that time did believe it, but then one of the bombs didn't go off. And when the Irish Army dealt with that bomb, it was proven that it was a German bomb. So the German ambassador was called for Ireland, don't forget, it was a neutral country. And one of the buildings that was hit was the synagogue. Most coincidental. The safest synagogue in Europe gets hit with a stray bomb. So when De Valera got the compensation of the Germans who they paid, he gave the Jews their fair share to repair their building. But they added some of their own money to it, and they built a more elaborate synagogue in a more fashionable part of town, and it is a lovely building. So the only Hitler-built synagogue in the world is built it's in Dublin. Now, there was Jews took part in the 1916 Rising, even though they wouldn't have been in Ireland very long before it. They would have been only in Ireland less than 20 years so long. And they participated in the 1916 Rising on the Republican side. And then there was two Jews from Finland who were members of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, that actually deserted off a ship during the Rising and joined the insurgents in the GPO. One of them actually died. He was killed in the fighting, and that led to a problem. Where was he going to be buried? Because at that time, okay, you could be only buried in a Protestant graveyard, or you could be only buried in a Catholic graveyard. So where were they going to? And then someone said he's a Jew, so he was buried in the Jewish graveyard. But then the people who owned the grave had emigrated to America, and when one of them died, an old woman, and she wanted to be buried with her husband, so her body was brought back from New York. And when they opened the grave, they found there was a strange body in it, because that was the poor unfortunate fellow from there. Right, I'm going to finish. Right, I'm not going on forever. Right, and the Jews, they have a very good history now. Now, the president of Israel at the moment is the son of an Irish Jew who was the head rabbi in Dublin. Most of the Jews that emigrated since the war, the population, they've gone down. There were 7,000 Jews in my father's time in the 1930s, in around the South Circular Road where I'm telling you. Now, there's not. Most of them emigrated to America. Some of them were Zionists and emigrated to Israel. And the president of Israel at the moment is the son of an Irish Jew. And his father was actually the president of Israel previous to that. That's
interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, William. It's always a pleasure just to listen to you.
Huh?
You really must have a slot on here at some point.
John, please.
Right, thanks a lot. Thanks, Ian. I missed the first half an hour of your talk inadvertently, but anyway, just to cut to the chase, what I didn't understand before this, and I still don't understand, and that's the difference between the Jewish experience of Western Europe and the Jewish experience of Eastern Europe. You pointed out that in early feudalism in Western Europe, the Jews played a trading role, and what grew out of that later on as feudalism began to be replaced, or at least get mixed in with mercantile capital, that the Jewish role changed and became a bit more specific around money lending and early banking and so on. When you talked about the Jews being ousted from England and from Western Europe through the Crusades, which I knew about, and going to the East, going to the Pale part of the Romanov Empire, which essentially was Ukraine and Poland, as I understand it. That there was a feudal society, you said. Now, but whereas the Jews were able to thrive in the West within an early feudal society, it seems they were not able to thrive within the feudal society in Eastern Europe. And I didn't hear an explanation for that. Maybe you can't give one, but I do wonder about that, and what the and also going on from that a little bit. I do know that Eastern Europe generally remained in the early part of the 20th century a very, very underdeveloped agricultural zone, and to some extent still is. What role did economically Jews have within those societies before the Second World War?
A couple of things. In East, so Jews were effectively being forced eastwards by the fact that the market and capitalism was developing in the West. So Jews were being forced out of the roles that they previously had in banking and trade and so on, and so moved eastwards. And so there was a period of absolute flourishing in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, in those kinds of areas. Some Jews were connected with farming, but not a great many. Most were connected with banking and commerce of one sort or another. But remember, this is mercantile capital, not capitalism proper. From that point of view, there was the antagonism that grew up between Jews who might have been intermediaries between nobles and peasants. So they might have been tax farmers, effectively tax collectors, on behalf of nobles, and were tolerated by nobles in the context of Eastern Europe. Once Jews began to be allowed back into Western Europe, they tended to be quite assimilated. And so if you think of someone like Sigmund Freud, for example, living in Vienna, very much the non-Jewish Jew, very much influenced by his Jewish heritage, but not religious practicing Jew. If we think of the way in which Jews were assimilated in England, for example, after Cromwell, tended to be quite prosperous initially. If you see, there's an interesting kind of representation of a Jew in some of William Hogarth's work, I think, an engraving in the 18th century. So relatively prosperous. It's not until the 19th century that it's the poor Jews coming to Britain and elsewhere, forced out by pogroms in the East, because by then capitalism is fully advanced into Eastern Europe as well. And but of course the assimilation of Jews in Western Europe came to be challenged, and it actually raises the contradiction that exists in capitalism. The Dreyfus case was of course the famous one, where on the one hand liberal democracy is supposed to be concerned with the freedom of the individual, the citizen, the owner of property, even if it's just their labor power. But that contradiction is exposed in a sense by the Dreyfus case and becomes the basis then for it wasn't just the Dreyfus case that motivated Theodor Herzl, but it was definitely a factor saying, you know, we can't therefore have a place within Western liberal society. But the Eastern Jews went through the same kind of process of immiseration, really, of being forced into the interstices of capitalist society rather than assuming their full assuming the important role that they previously had in a feudal society. Does that answer it? Does that make sense?
Sorry, I've muted you. If you want to say something, you have to press unmute again.
Yeah, Ian, I understand that, but I'm not sure the extent of industrial capitalism that was present at the time of the pogroms in Eastern Europe. The impression I've had from my reading is that it was not developed until 100 years later, really, that it was still a very agrarian, rural part of the world, essentially. Certainly Russia was at the time of the revolution, had a very small industrial sector just around a few major cities. Presumably that was the same in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. So I don't really see how the antagonism to Jews, which happened on such a scale in Eastern Europe, how that arose there from within the population. It wasn't a fully fledged capitalist society, or was it?
No, not fully fledged. I mean, certainly not industrial. And where you do have industrialization, it's interesting where the Jews didn't end up evenly distributed through the industrial process, as it were. So they would tend to be concerned with particular areas of consumption goods. So textiles, for example, or so consumer goods, really, rather than say metallurgy, or so you didn't get many Jewish blacksmiths, but you would get a Jewish tailor, that kind of thing. But also being forced out of their previous roles as kind of bankers and end up as being shopkeepers, or shopkeepers who then sold food on tick. So so that you ended up in debt to a Jewish shopkeeper. And Abraham Leon talked at one point about some of the anti-Semitism in Poland in the 1920s, where being a shopkeeper was synonymous with being a Jew. So he tells this story about a woman telling her son to go to the Jew, but don't go to the Jew who is a Jew. Go to the Jew that's a Pole, because there's become an association between sort of minor usury, minor lending, either associated with publicans or associated with small shopkeepers or pawnbrokers. So from that point of view, the antagonism between the Polish peasantry and proletariat was with that stratum of impoverished Jews, but were still related in some way with trade. The other thing was that there was a Jewish proletariat, and of course it was the Jewish proletariat that was being represented by the Bund, among others. But the Bund, of course, were important they were resolutely anti-Zionist, and that's the importance of them as well. Zionism was a kind of very few Jews before World War II were Zionist, and that fascism itself, of course, only really comes into being because of this being caught between the hammer and anvil of decaying feudalism and rotting capitalism. I think that's the basis of the antagonism. And then of course, the other place where Jews were often found was in liberal professions. I remember coming across this statistic about the number of doctors in Berlin. The Jewish population of Germany at the start of World War II was less than 1%, but something like 30% of doctors in Berlin were Jewish, and a high proportion of doctors in Germany joined the National Socialists. There were a lot of petty bourgeois elements, of course, in the Nazi Party, but it's kind of tempting to conclude that German doctors were trying to eliminate their competitors.
There's a bit of a stretch, maybe, but let's not go down that road at the moment. But thank you very much, Ian. That was a really fascinating session. There were really good comments in the chat. Your best session yet.
Oh.
You've certainly done a lot of work and become an expert. See, preparing for this session. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. Comrades, we'll be revisiting questions like Zionism. Tony will be joining us for 3 sessions to discuss Zionism before the Holocaust, after, and during the Holocaust as well. So that'd be interesting, because Ian just touched on it, how it's changed and how it's been used for its own purpose, etc. We'll also look at the Holocaust Industry, the book by Norman Finkelstein. We tried to get Norman Finkelstein himself, but he is super busy. If anybody who knows, who signed up to his email list thing, will see he was just on Piers Morgan, etc. So I'm afraid I don't think he's got time for us, but we'll look at his book anyway, because it was a really important book that explained why the Holocaust became like a whole industry. And we're looking at that next week. It's going to be really interesting as well. Yasmin Martha from Hands of the People of Iran will be looking at Hamas, where it comes from, how it's developed, etc., which role it plays, what kind of program it has, and we'll probably end up discussing as well our attitude to Hamas and what happened on October the 7th. So that'd be a different kind of interesting discussion, but interesting nevertheless. Thank you very much for joining us. With over 100 people again in the audience, is certainly an interesting subject that needs exploring, and we'll have hundreds of other people watching these videos online, and we'll continue with it. If any of you have any ideas for additional sessions, we can always extend it, etc. So just get in touch, info@ymarx.com. Thanks, Ian. Thank you, comrades. See you next week. Bye-bye.